In fact, the Word is foundational, but without the good news, we can lose the purpose for why we're coming to church. We'll just go back to our home and our castle and live within our little bubble and never reach the lost around us and see the church built the way Jesus sought to build it. So just hearing these connections, bathing them in prayer, it's exciting, isn't it? Not knowing what God will do in 2024. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh. We're coming back to that, and we're going to wrap it up this month. We're studying the spiritual disciplines of Jesus. And for me, I don't know about for you, one of the most refreshing things in this study is that we are not studying how we should discipline our lives, but how did Jesus discipline his life? And then we briefly apply it at the end, because the more we look at Jesus Christ, the more it strengthens us, right? And our lives are automatically changed when we look to Christ. So our goal is to go lighter on the application and more on just the nature of what Jesus did. We have seen the discipline of Bible study, the discipline of prayer, the disciplines of fasting and rest, the discipline of worship. And this morning, we're going to look at the discipline of fellowship. The discipline of fellowship. And with all of these, when we talk about a spiritual discipline, we're talking about something that you have to actually premeditate and think about doing, right? Something that's not a discipline is like eating a tub of ice cream every day. That is not a discipline because it doesn't take any work to do, and any of us could do that. I could see falling into that, and it would be quite good. But a discipline is where you're trying to do something that is right, but there are pitfalls on either side, so you have to put in some effort to do it the right way. Whether it's prayer or Bible study, those two right off the bat, we know, well, that requires discipline. But when we come to something like fellowship, it's not as apparent why this might be considered a spiritual discipline. But I didn't come up with the idea that it was a spiritual discipline. In studying this and researching, it was suggested by several that this was a discipline in Jesus' life. And they combine it with another discipline that takes on more of the modern thought of fellowship. So let's begin this morning by defining, what do we mean when we talk about fellowship? Can anyone tell us, what are we referring to? And in a little bit, we'll get into the word when we look at the life of Christ. So I hate not starting with the word, but let's start with a question. What is fellowship? Lindsay? Okay, spending time with other believers. Anyone else? Mom?
Sharing your thoughts and hearts with others.
Okay, sharing thoughts and hearts with other believers. And those bring up two, like we'll think of a get-together with other believers is often called a fellowship. Or conversations in the lobby or between the rows. The church is called fellowship. Lisa?
Like-minded interests.
Okay, nice. It's getting to the root of the biblical word, a like-minded interest. So obviously you can't have fellowship if you absolutely don't have like mind in any way. Maybe one more thought on it, Rich? Okay, sharing your burdens with one another, knowing that brothers go through different discouragements in the world, and you're able to share with one another to strengthen. So we know that fellowship is something that doesn't just happen, even though it's easier than certain things. There are some churches that's all they do, right? It's just fellowship. There's a church nearby, can't remember where, I think fellowship is in its name, and they avoid doctrine at all cost. And they state that. Their goal is just to fellowship. But what's interesting is, and I think we all know this here, is that there is fellowship in the modern use of the word, and then there's fellowship in the Bible. Let's just go to 1 John. I wasn't planning to look at this reference, but let's just read this verse as we think of fellowship doctrinally, and then we'll look at it in the life of Christ. Biblically, the Greek word koinonia is a very powerful word. And while it includes something of all of what the ladies and also then Rich said, it cannot happen without a doctrinal biblical basis. It's impossible without a basis of unified faith in doctrine. So this was from a source, an anonymous source, or with no name. A mutual koinonia is a mutual cooperation in carrying out God's worship, God's work, and God's will based upon shared beliefs, convictions, and behaviors. Koinonia is a mutual cooperation in carrying out God's worship, His work, and His will based upon shared beliefs, convictions, and behaviors. And in 1 John 1:3, John said, "That which we have seen and heard declare we unto you, that ye also may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And these things write we unto you, that your joy may be full." So if we're going to talk about this discipline in Jesus' life, it's so important, isn't it, to think about koinonia versus fellowship. This common use today this is probably the most commonly understood. I think we have a little bit deeper common understanding, but fun time of food with friends with similar interests. So usually Christian circles use the word, right? It also includes outreach. Last Sunday night we had a New Year's fellowship, and we used the modern use of the word for fellowship, right? Because all that we do as Christians should be koinonia. But we called it a fellowship with games and food, and we'll slap a devotion in there. No, I'm just kidding. We began with the word. But sometimes it'll be like, we'll squeeze like a 5-minute devotion in, but it's all about the food and the fun. Anyways, there is a reality to getting times outside of worship where you get together for fun and food. Without that, you might never really get to know each other as well as you could. When you hear people crack their corny jokes, it just does something different, right? Like Nathan got his dad a calendar of dad jokes this year. I hear they're pretty good. Dad jokes? Never mind. He's not laughing. Okay, here's what we're going to look at this morning. Both the biblical idea of koinonia and the common conception of a fun time with food and friends, Jesus practiced both in his life. And both are actually brought out by different writers as notable disciplines in his life. In fact, the second one he was accused of excess. So we're going to consider both. So having defined it, let's begin. B, what are some ways that Jesus demonstrated a discipline of koinonia? And we want to write koinonia on our handout, reminding ourselves that for this first assessment or analysis of the life of Jesus Christ, we're thinking of biblical fellowship. Remembering, it's a mutual cooperation in carrying out God's worship, work, and will based on shared beliefs, convictions, and behaviors. Where could we see that Jesus was convicted of practicing that in his life? The idea is, I'm not an island. I am fulfilling the will of God with others. Maybe someone who hasn't answered a question yet, just to try and I'll come back to those who already raised their hands. Anyone? Some of you quieter folk. Songway? Okay, you saw the hint. You saw the hint. I was putting on there, I'm like, why do I put these pictures? They're giveaway. Well, the Last Supper could be an example of a time of food and enjoyment, but does it indicate an element? Is it one element of a koinonia that was very important in Jesus' life? What's that? Okay, celebrating, well, still, that's the second element, more of where Jesus would take part in celebrations. But thinking of this idea of joint fellowship throughout life. Okay, Lisa? Okay, once again, that would be more that second element of enjoying a time of food. Dad, you had raised your hand a while ago, but I passed over you.
Well, I was going to say prior to that, it started in Jesus' life.
Yeah. The very idea of the 12 is going way beyond the events they spent together. That whole idea of having these men that lived with him and went through his life. Yes, Heather?
I'm trying to look where the Last Supper happened in John. And in John 13, it talks about the abuse of the Passover. During the supper, the devil made Judas Iscariot leave. And then I think that chapters 14 through 17 are the content of that supper. Was that the same occasion?
Yeah.
That is theological, doctrinal teaching, talking about God, talking about Scripture, prayer. That's very different from like a church potluck,
Yeah.
or maybe it shouldn't be.
Oh, by the way, Dad, we forgot about the microphone. We could, if you'd like to grab it, we can start passing it around, but I'll repeat until people have the microphone. Heather mentioned the Last Supper being one instance. There was much more than food in John 13 through 17 or 14 through 17. There was deep theological teaching, and there were questions and answers. There was discussion. Where are you going? How can we know the way? Things like that. But think about the life of Christ with his disciples. That is an incredible picture of koinonia through the whole thing. Think about this definition again. A mutual cooperation in carrying out God's worship, work, and will based upon shared beliefs, convictions, and behaviors. The goal of the disciples was that very thing. What happened when Jesus left and they were filled with the Spirit? They continued on the work that Jesus had begun. Now, there were certain things that only Jesus could do, like being a substitute for our sins. But he said, through the disciples, many other truths would be given to the world through the Spirit of God in them. Let's look at some passages. Mark chapter 3, verse 14. Jesus, you talk about discipline. His life was never his own once these 14 men were in it. And my dad referred to that verse in John, which we'll skip since he mentioned it. Where dwellest thou? Where do you live? I'd be like, well, I live here, but we can meet at this building every once in a while. They wanted to live with him. But that was the view at that time of how a disciple would follow a master or teacher. And Jesus embraced it. Mark 3:14, and he ordained 12 that they should be with him, and that he might send them forth to preach. I believe that verse encompasses this idea of koinonia, spending time together so that you can go out and work together. And you're not always together when this koinonia is active. One of the reasons we share the good news at the beginning of Sunday school and before prayer meeting or before the Bible class each Wednesday is to remind ourselves that we are not on our own through the week, or at least we shouldn't be. We're all doing the same thing, and we're coming back together to report. How are we co-laboring with God and with one another in the harvest field? And so Jesus wanted that. He also, it appears, wanted their fellowship with himself, to be with him. Not just for their benefit, but his. I think we could say that. Let's go to Luke 22:28, jumping all the way to the end. This is a beautiful description, I believe, of koinonia. Luke 22:28. Ye are they which have continued with me in my temptations. Isn't that beautiful? Jesus just pouring out his heart a little bit. You've been with me through it all. The disciples didn't leave because it wasn't just a potluck, as Heather mentioned. It wasn't just a fun time with ping pong, pork, and platitudes. There you go. They understood, no, this is a program. One more P, but separate. This is an actual program we're a part of. And we are with Jesus because we agree with his doctrine, because we believe in him, his person, and we understand that we are going to reign with him. We're going to work with him. And Jesus says, you've been with me through my trials, through my temptations. That's real koinonia, isn't it? And then Matthew 28, verse 20, the last thing before Jesus ascended into heaven. And this is precious because this is in a really specific way for us. At the end of the Great Commission, as we think of the disciple-making mandate, which I believe ties in this idea of koinonia so much, we are not islands, and we must discipline ourselves to pass on to others what Jesus passed on to us, the idea that together, based on the Word of God and a mutual love and trust in Christ, we are to work. But in verse 20, Jesus said, Matthew 28:20, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. The fellowship doesn't end. And that's why 60 years later, the Apostle John said in the verse that we read in 1 John 1, that which we have seen and heard, we declare to you. Doing exactly what Jesus commanded there, that you may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son. It never ended, did it? And that's what makes koinonia so precious, is that Jesus is still in the midst when it's genuine. So the disciples, from what I could find in studying His life, by far, they were the clearest example of Jesus' discipline of koinonia. And if you say, well, I'm not sure that's a discipline, I think if we tried living with 12 men for 3.5 years, my brother Nate was in a Christian men's dorm in college, and I can't remember how he put it one time, something like, I got to get out of here. Like, the stuff they'd find in the fridge, and they're supposedly Christian, but one of the guys got slain in the spirit in the middle of the living room floor, He's like, for 3 hours, we have stuff to do here. Like, we don't even agree doctrinally anyways. So Jesus dealt with far worse. Koinonia with the disciple. Oh, I just gave another one away. So how about, I'll just say this. Well, let me ask, are there any other examples of koinonia now that we've thought about the disciples? Heather? You already answered. Somebody else. Sorry. I can be blunt with my wife, but I can't be, actually. I need to be compassionate with everybody. Rich? Yep. And I have that listed last year, only because it's kind of like the capstone. But let's go to John 17:21. To repeat, I forgot about the microphone again, sorry. Jesus' fellowship with the Father. And that reminds us that at the core of koinonia is an experiential fellowship with God. That is more than just experiencing His presence, but it is working together with God. And there's a song that I learned in Bible Club I always remember. Is it laborers together in the harvest fields of God? And anyways, it's catchy. But you remember that is that's koinonia, and little kids can even learn it. And be reminded by their parents. It's not just about, just us. There is a world that this fellowship needs to be. We need to bring people in to know Christ and to know the body. And it's a wonderful thing that we give to people when we give them the gospel. This is something different than the world's gatherings. John 17:21, that they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. All of John 17 really does bring it out. The relationship that Jesus had with His Father is something we actually enter into through koinonia with Jesus Christ. But that was certainly what the disciples would have seen and heard as they spent time with Jesus. This man is of God. He is the Son of God. His relationship with the Father is otherworldly. It's heavenly. I'll rattle through a couple more. How about, before I put that on the screen, how about the koinonia of worship? Jesus demonstrated a discipline every Sabbath day, every feast. He was there. Even the feast where His brothers said, come on down to the feast, show yourself, do a miracle. And He said, I'm not going. Because He didn't want to be coerced for the wrong reason. So later He went because He couldn't keep away, is the idea that I get there in John chapter 7. And I won't turn to a passage on this because we've seen it so many times, but was there a koinonia between Jesus and the people who would gather at a synagogue, even if they weren't yet believers in Him? That's maybe a rhetorical question. I'll explain. there were two different dispensations. The dispensation of law, and the people of Israel was going to soon fade into the dispensation of grace, where God would deal with Jew and Gentile in the church. But at that time, it was still a fellowship to gather with the people of God in the synagogue and to read the Old Testament, to honor the promises, to think of the covenants, to read those things. There was a genuine fellowship, even though many of the people weren't yet realizing who the Messiah was. And that's like the book of Acts, where many people were waking up to it and realizing it is time to put our faith in Messiah, who is Jesus. But in the synagogue and at the feast days, there was still genuine fellowship in what the law pointed to, even though Christ was about to fulfill it all when he died for our sins. Okay, well, I'll make that question more rhetorical since it wasn't as clear. How about this? We're going to look at it at passages in a moment. We won't look at them yet. Did Jesus fellowship with sinners? Can you koinonia with sinners? Whenever someone raises their hand, we'll send them the mic. Okay, Heather, I'll let you answer this one. Dad, if you'd like to pass the mic.
I was looking at Luke 19 with Zacchaeus, and you have somebody who is a sinner, and behind closed doors, we don't know what is said, but when he, comes back out, when we see back into what's happening around the table, he says, I will give my possessions to the poor. I'll give back 4 times as much. And Jesus said, today salvation has come to this house because he too is the son of Abraham. So whatever that conversation was, it brought him to conviction and salvation.
Yeah. Zacchaeus and Jesus went into the house for what the Pharisees believed was a time of fellowship, but Zacchaeus came out truly unified with the whole program of God, let alone with Jesus Christ. So clearly there was some koinonia there when he came out, and the very character of Christ was showing itself. So let's go back to that question. Can you koinonia with sinners? Are we called and commanded to koinonia with sinners? Lisa has a comment.
I would say yes, because then you are trying to bring them to Christ. And I was thinking of Romans 15, where Macedonia and the Jewish people had nothing in common but Christ. So when you bring them to that, and if you have someone who is an unbeliever at the time, but then you're reaching out to them, and if you can get them to where they believe on Christ, then you have a common ground to start from.
Right. So I think what you said there at the end is key. When they come to Christ, then you have common ground. So technically, koinonia requires the common ground. So technically speaking, when you reach out to someone using a time together of food and things, we are given that example. We're going to see that next in the life of Jesus. But when Zacchaeus and Jesus went into the house, there was no koinonia. When they came out, there was. So I think it's just important to remember, if we're thinking of biblical fellowship, we can't have it until a person is born again, until they're saved. But you got at what we're going to look at next. And that is that Jesus did a lot of things that today we would think it looks like he's fellowshipping with sinners. But he wasn't. He was spending time with sinners, but he didn't claim that it was koinonia. And today, churches confuse those things. And a lot of churches are designed to try and almost have more unbelievers than believers. It's like their goal just to fill the walls. Granted, they might share the gospel, but what's often forgotten is that church is like the high point of koinonia, which is impossible with unbelievers. So if the majority is believers, then you could see how an unbeliever could be brought in and be affected by that. But we have to understand light cannot fellowship with darkness. And those are the words of Paul. Can light fellowship with darkness? No, it cannot. Does that mean that light should not reach out to darkness? No. Jesus said you are lights in the world. A lantern must be set on a hill so that we can shine. That's not, by the way, America, as Reagan said, even though that was a great speech. That means that our lifestyle, our dedication to Christ will shine to this world. So I think that's good to think about. Levi is the most familiar example, probably, of Jesus spending time with sinners. We're going to run out of time. We'll get to that in a moment. There was then the koinonia of the Father with Jesus, with the Father, and his own. By the way, koinonia, when we think of gathered times of worship like this, I think this is the high point of it. Manifested koinonia here. But it is a picture of what's to come, and that is the wedding supper of the Lamb, when there will be eternal koinonia in the flesh, but it will begin with that merger of the common view and the biblical view. We are going to feast together on common ground, doctrinal fellowship. It's going to be wonderful, and it's going to begin with a feast. So I don't want to cut the group time short, so let's try and go through part C in your handout quicker. What ways did Jesus demonstrate a discipline of fellowship? That is more the celebration of food and enjoyment. Do we see times in his life in which this took place? Not even requiring that, you have common ground. Okay, now, someone who hasn't answered, come on, give us... Yeah, Josh. Oh, Lisa's bringing it back. Even if it's a one-word answer, we're giving you the mic.
Okay, I think it is, too. Is it when Jesus turned the water into wine?
Yeah.
For the wedding?
The picture. I gave the hint, right?
There we go.
Was that what gave it away?
Yeah.
So the wedding of Cana is the most familiar. For time's sake, we won't turn there. I think we're all familiar with this account. But it's also caused a lot of Christians to stumble post-prohibition, and with the issues of alcohol in our age. Just thinking back, we sometimes join with the Pharisees in saying, "What's the deal here?" But the wedding of Cana, we want to understand that Jesus, obviously, as well as his fellow Jewish men, would have accepted the warnings of Old Testament against drunkenness. There would have been the dilution of wine with water due to bacteria in those days. And there was also, we want to caution ourselves against ever assuming that Jesus abused any good thing to the point of sinfulness. We know it says that Jesus was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. All that we know is Jesus, he ate and drank with sinners. At the wedding of Cana, he enjoyed the celebration. He never sinned, and we know that absolutely. But he enjoyed the celebration. So there's been all sorts of theological papers written about the wedding of Cana, but here's the point. He celebrated a wedding. He enjoyed the celebration. And let's read one verse, John chapter 2, just to show how Jesus not only enjoyed the celebration, but he endorsed it by being there. And he actually made it better by what he did, turning the water into wine. John 2:9, when the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said unto him, every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee. So without getting into the whole debate, obviously we believe being biblical, we know that Jesus would not have abused as unfortunately it happens in Christian circles today. But Jesus bettered the celebration through his miracle and by being there. Jesus believed in this form of fellowship. Now this is the idea, the sense in which if there's something that you couldn't endorse, or Jesus couldn't have endorsed, I don't believe he would have gone. We don't have any example of Jesus being in a place where his presence would have endorsed an ungodly thing. In this case, it was the marriage of a Jewish couple. It was something he could fully endorse. Today, if a believer is marrying an unbeliever, no doubt that's something we would not want to endorse. Any other examples, though, of Jesus? Yes, Nathan, are you willing to take the mic? I know there's several people from the church that listen online and have mentioned they'd like to hear.
So he visited the houses of believers. Like example would be Mary and Martha.
Yes. he believed in hospitality. And we're going to look at that study in a couple weeks. But you know Jesus' version of hospitality? He went to other people's houses. And that's great. He's like, I'm coming over. That's okay, right? So I didn't list them all, but frequent meals. I wish we had time to look at these verses. Those meals were either with Christians, but sometimes they were with unbelievers. How about the meal at the house of Simon the Pharisee? Almost no common ground, other than that they're both Jews. In fact, Simon is attacking him while he's having his feet washed by this sinful woman who is now a repentant sinner. There's a sense in which Jesus was having more true koinonia with that woman than he could have with the Pharisees who invited him to dinner. But he is reaching out with those Pharisees. He was willing to eat dinner with them, like you might be willing to, well, Dr. Houghton. Now, this is something that we would not necessarily recommend, but Dr. Houghton, as the chair of systematic theology at Faith Seminary, would eat lunch with a Catholic priest. And his goal was to win him to Christ. But there you have two men. You have Dr. Houghton who, anyways, we'll leave it at that. His goal was to win the man, as Jesus was here. You have Levi, the tax collector, who gathered all his friends. Jesus ate food with him. There was fellowship because Levi's repentant. But there were also many men who needed salvation. And to them, Jesus said, I'm here to deliver you from your sickness. He was very clear about it. The house of Mary and Martha, or Zacchaeus, as Heather mentioned. And one of the things that really stuck with me in this whole idea of fellowship in the modern word is Zacchaeus is a powerful example. By going to his house, Zacchaeus' amazement at the love of Jesus seemed to be what broke him down. And when they left, Jesus said, salvation has come to this house. There's real fellowship here now. And he said, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. And I just can't help but stop and ask, are we following this pattern of Christ? Because this is so powerful. Do our kids and our family see us following this pattern of Jesus Christ? Where we reach the lost through food and fun, so to speak. Something we can endorse. You know, I don't go to the bar to reach the drunks of the town. But there are ways to reach them that are loving. The parable of the prodigal son. As soon as the son returns home, what did the father do? Anybody? He celebrated. There was a feast, slay the fatted calf. And the other son, who had been true, said, this isn't right, you know, how can this be? But Jesus believed that there is room for celebration, especially when a soul comes to Christ. And of course, there was the accusation made about him that he was a glutton and a winebibber. This was not accurate. And we want to remember that. And sometimes Christians today will say, see, Jesus, he was that. No, he wasn't. It was an exaggeration about him because of his lifestyle of the enjoyment of celebration and of meals. I don't want to pass over one verse, and then we'll go to our group work, Mark 2:18. I'll read it as soon as I get there, Mark 2:18. This is important, very important when it comes to the idea of fellowship in this common acceptance of the word today. Mark 2:18. And the disciples of John and of the Pharisees used to fast, and they came and said to him, why did the disciples of John and of the Pharisees fast, but thy disciples fast not? And Jesus said unto them, can the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then shall they fast in those days. We have Jesus today, the bridegroom. There is room for joy. There's room for fellowship in this sense. Did I pass over anything too quickly? Any questions? Dad? Yeah. I want to make very clear before Dad what you said. And it's hard to even touch on the wedding of Cana without saying we have the conviction of staying pure from the world celebrations, right, as Christians. And the world even appreciates that when we welcome them to a meal that has water and Mountain Dew. But we do that understanding we can still celebrate with the unsaved, though we don't fall into their sinful habits. Yes, Dad?
Well, inevitably, for Christ and the disciples, there was the fellowship of his sufferings that they entered into with him and with one another.
Yeah. And that goes deep into the koinonia. They suffered, all of them but John, martyred. And that is the inevitable end of koinonia. We will suffer together. And then there are the times of celebration together, all looking forward to the marriage supper of the Lamb. We'll be raised, and there will be no more suffering in the midst of that fellowship with the Father. So for our group work this morning, I want to take 5 minutes, look up these two passages, Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. What should our koinonia look like according to this passage? In 1 Corinthians 10:39, what does this passage say about our enjoyment of food or celebration with others? If you can get together, and we'll have to have maximum efficiency, jump right to the verses. And a couple guys here that are, let's see, alone can pair up. Well, just to mention a couple things as it's time to close. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, I think, bring out much more than just gathering at church, right? There is that element. But the idea of provoking each other to love and together looking for the return of Christ in that wedding supper, it's just a powerful picture of koinonia. And then 1 Corinthians 10:31, glorifying God at a dinner table involves, Dewan brought out a good point, blessing the food before we eat, no matter who we're with. The things we talk about at the table, the music that's playing, the drinks that are there are many ways to honor God, glorify Him at the table. Well, why don't we pray? Rich, could you close our time in prayer, please?